The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. 12-year-old Aiden lay on the hospital bed. His once bright eyes now dull and tired. His body had grown weak. His spirit exhausted from the long battle he had been fighting. The doctors had done everything they could, but the truth was undeniable. Aiden only had a few days left to live. The news had shattered his parents, leaving them in silent despair. But amidst the grief, there was one soul who refused to give up. Max, Aiden's loyal golden retriever. Max had been by Aiden's side ever since he was a little boy. The two had an unbreakable bond, a friendship that went beyond words. Whenever Aiden was scared, Max was there to comfort him. When he was too weak to get out of bed, Max would curl up beside him, his warm body a source of silent strength. And now, as Aiden lay in the hospital bed, his breaths shallow and slow, Max seemed to sense that time was running out. No one could explain it, but Max refused to leave Aiden's side. He whined softly, his eyes filled with an understanding that no one could quite comprehend. The nurses allowed him to stay, moved by the way he nuzzled Aiden's hand, as if trying to give him a reason to keep fighting. Even the doctors, who had seen countless patients and countless goodbyes, found themselves deeply moved by the sight of the devoted dog refusing to let go. One evening, Aiden's mother sat beside his bed, gently stroking his hair as silent tears slipped down her face. "I wish I could take your pain away," she whispered. Aiden gave her a weak smile. "I just wish I had more time," he said softly. His father turned away, his shoulders shaking, unable to bear the weight of his son's words. But just when it seemed that nothing could change fate, something incredible happened. Max, who had been resting beside Aiden, suddenly stood up. His ears perked, his tail wagged slightly, and his eyes sparkled with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Without hesitation, he jumped off the bed and ran out of the hospital room, surprising everyone. The nurses and doctors tried to stop him, but Max was determined. He bolted down the halls, weaving past patients and hospital staff, his paws hitting the cold floors with urgency. No one understood what was happening, but there was something in Max's behavior that made them pause. He wasn't just running, he was on a mission. Back in the hospital room, Aiden's mother wiped her tears, confused by Max's sudden departure. "Where is he going?" she asked, looking at the door where the dog had disappeared. Aiden, too weak to even lift his head, whispered, Maybe he knows something we don't." And he was right. What Max did next would leave everyone speechless. Even the most experienced doctors, who had spent years witnessing both miracles and tragedies, would find themselves overcome with emotion. Because Max wasn't just running blindly. He was about to change Aiden's fate in a way no one could have ever imagined. But how? And what had Max sensed that no one else could? What happened next was something no one would forget. The hospital hallways echoed with the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses, but amidst the usual chaos, Max ran with a purpose only he understood. He weaved past startled hospital staff, his nails clicking against the polished floor, his golden fur a blur of movement. People called after him, but Max didn't stop. He was searching for something or someone. Back in the hospital room, Aiden's mother sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her son's bed. "Why did he run like that?" she murmured, glancing at her husband. But he had no answers. Aiden's father stood near the window, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. He had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now, as their son's life slipped away, he felt powerless. Aiden, though weak, still had a small flicker of curiosity in his tired eyes. "Maybe he's trying to find something for me," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. His mother wiped her eyes, forcing a small smile. "Max always knows when you need him the most," she said, brushing his hair back gently. Meanwhile, Max had reached the hospital's main entrance. He stopped abruptly, his ears twitching, his nose sniffing the air as if searching for a scent that only he could detect. Then suddenly he bolted outside, past the automatic glass doors into the cool night. A security guard shouted after him, but Max didn't slow down. His instincts were driving him forward. His paws hit the pavement, his breath coming in quick puffs as he ran through the dark streets. The city lights flickered above him, and cars honked in the distance, but none of it mattered. He had something important to do. As he ran, his mind was filled with memories of Aiden, of the boy who had loved him unconditionally. He remembered the laughter, the warm hugs, the nights spent curled up together under a blanket. But now Aiden was slipping away, and Max could feel it in his bones. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't. Back at the hospital, Aiden's condition was worsening. His breaths had grown shallower, his skin paler. The doctors had told his parents that it was only a matter of time now. Aiden's mother refused to accept it. She held his hand tightly, whispering prayers, her tears falling onto the white hospital sheets. Aiden's father clenched his fists, his eyes stinging. "There has to be something," he said quietly, his voice filled with desperation. "Anything." But the doctor simply looked at him with sympathy. "We've done everything we can." Outside, Max kept running. He wasn't just following a scent anymore. He was following something deeper, something that couldn't be explained. And then, just when it seemed like he had gone too far, he stopped. There, sitting alone on a cold bench under the dim glow of a street lamp, was a man. He looked tired, worn, his clothes slightly ragged. His head was down, his hands clasped together as if deep in thought. Max watched him closely, his body tense, his heart pounding. Then, as if sensing something, the man looked up. His eyes met Max's, and for a moment there was silence. Then Max took a step forward. The man hesitated but didn't move away. Slowly, Max walked closer, his tail low. His eyes filled with something almost pleading. The man frowned, confused. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. And then Max did something unexpected. He barked. Loud, urgent, desperate. The sound echoed through the empty street, cutting through the silence. The man's eyes widened, and something flickered in them. He knew that bark. It wasn't just any bark. It was the kind that carried a message, a plea. Max turned, took a few steps away, then looked back at the man. It was clear he wanted him to follow. The man hesitated for only a second before pushing himself up from the bench. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him to trust the dog. He took a deep breath and started walking. As Max led him through the streets, the man's mind raced. He hadn't stepped into a hospital in years, not since the day he had left everything behind. He had once been someone people relied on, someone who could make a difference. But life had a way of breaking even the strongest hearts. Now, as he followed the determined dog through the cold night, something in him stirred, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Oh. Back in the hospital, Aiden's mother gently stroked her son's cheek. His breathing was barely there now, each rise and fall of his chest fainter than the last. The machines beeped softly, their rhythm slower than before. Then suddenly, the door to the hospital room burst open. A nurse, breathless and wide-eyed, stood there. "You need to come," she said urgently. Aiden's parents exchanged worried glances before hurrying after her. Down the hall, near the hospital entrance, a small crowd had gathered. Nurses, doctors, and even some patients stood in stunned silence. And at the center of it all was Max, his tail wagging furiously, his golden fur slightly damp from the night air. Beside him stood the man. His eyes swept the room, taking in the faces, the white coats, the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. He swallowed hard. It had been so long since he had been here, so long since he had felt like he belonged. Then, his gaze landed on Aiden's parents. The mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. The father's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled at his sides. "It's you." The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he looked down at Max, who gazed up at him with eyes filled with trust. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beeped. The night was far from over. And what was about to happen next would leave everyone in that hospital, every doctor, every nurse, and every patient, witnessing something they would never ever forget. Aiden's mother could hardly breathe as she stood frozen in place. Her hands trembled, and her vision blurred with tears. The man standing before her was someone she had never expected to see again. For years she had tried to forget, tried to move on, but now, here he was, standing in the hospital lobby with Max by his side. Aiden's father clenched his jaw, his body rigid. His heart pounded as he took a slow step forward. His gaze locked on the man. You disappeared," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You left, and we never heard from you again." The man exhaled shakily, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "I know," he said. His voice was rough, weighed down by guilt. "I know I did." He looked down at Max, the dog who had found him in the darkness and dragged him back into the light. "But I think I was meant to be here." Aiden's mother shook her head, trying to process everything. "Why now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "After all these years, why now?" Before the man could answer, a nurse rushed up to them, her expression urgent. "Aiden's condition is critical," she said, her voice quick and serious. "You need to come now." All emotions were pushed aside as Aiden's parents turned and hurried toward their son's room. The man hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flickering across his face. But then he looked at Max, who stared at him expectantly, and he knew. He had to go. Inside the hospital room, Aiden lay motionless, his chest barely rising and falling. His skin was pale, his lips dry. The beeping of the monitor had slowed, and the doctors surrounding him spoke in hushed voices, their faces grim. His mother rushed to his bedside, gripping his frail hand. "Baby, I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." Aiden's father stood beside her, his fingers curling into a tight fist. He couldn't bear to see his son like this, to see him slipping away and knowing there was nothing he could do. Then, slowly, Aiden's eyelids fluttered open. His tired eyes searched the room, as if looking for something. And then they landed on the man. For a moment there was silence. Then Aiden's lips parted. "Uncle. Ethan." The name was barely more than a breath, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Aiden's mother gasped, her eyes widening. Aiden's father turned sharply, his expression unreadable. Ethan took a slow step forward, his hands shaking. He hadn't heard his name spoken by someone who loved him in years. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Yeah, kiddo, it's me." Aiden's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Max found you," he murmured. Ethan swallowed hard, emotion rising in his throat. "Yeah," he said softly. "He did." The doctors exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" Aiden's father exhaled sharply. "He's my brother," he said, his voice tight. "A doctor. Or at least he used to be." The room fell silent. Aiden's mother let out a shaky breath. "Ethan was one of the best pediatric surgeons in the country," she said quietly. "But after his wife died, he disappeared." She turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. "We searched for you. We tried to find you." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. "I wasn't the same person anymore," he admitted. "I didn't think I could save anyone ever again." Aiden let out a soft cough, drawing everyone's attention back to him. His tiny fingers gripped Ethan's hand weakly. "But, you can save me, right?" The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, delicate and full of impossible hope. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked at the machines, at the charts, at the weary expressions of the doctors standing around. He knew what they were thinking. He knew what they had already accepted. But then he looked at Max, the dog who had refused to give up, who had run through the night to find him, to bring him back here. Max didn't believe it was over. And suddenly neither did Ethan. He turned to the head doctor, his posture straightening, his old confidence flickering back to life. "Show me his file," he said. The doctor hesitated. "Ethan, we've tried everything." "Show me," Ethan repeated, his voice firm. The doctor exhaled but nodded, handing him the folder. Ethan flipped through the pages, scanning the test results, the treatments, the medications. His brain, which had been numb for so long, suddenly came alive, analyzing, searching, looking for something, anything that had been overlooked. Minutes passed in heavy silence. Aiden's mother held onto his hand, whispering to him softly. His father stood by the window, arms crossed, fear written all over his face. Then Ethan's breath caught. His eyes froze on one particular test result. He read it again and again. His heart pounded. "This," he murmured. "This can't be right." The head doctor frowned. "What is it?" Ethan looked up, his expression intense. "You've been treating him based on this assumption, but what if it's wrong?" He flipped the page around, pointing at a specific number. "This isn't consistent with the rest of the results. If this was misdiagnosed, then the treatment plan has been completely off." Aiden's parents stared at him, hope and fear battling in their eyes. The doctor looked doubtful. "Ethan, these tests were run multiple times." "Then we run them again," Ethan said firmly. "Now." The head doctor hesitated. Then, seeing the fire in Ethan's eyes, he nodded. "All right. We'll retest." Ethan turned to Aiden and squeezed his hand gently. "Hang in there, kiddo," he said. "I'm not letting you go without a fight." Aiden smiled weakly. "I knew Max would find you." Max, lying beside the bed, let out a quiet whimper and rested his head on Aiden's arm. No one in the room knew what the test results would reveal. No one knew if Ethan was right. But for the first time in a long time, hope flickered in their hearts. And all of it was because one dog refused to give up. The hospital room was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional beep of the machines and the faint rustling of papers as the doctors hurried to rerun Aiden's tests. His parents stood close to his bed, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Ethan paced near the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent years running from the past, from medicine, from everything that once defined him. But now, with Aiden's life hanging in the balance, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Max sat beside Aiden's bed, his ears perked, his warm brown eyes fixed on the boy he loved so much. Every so often, he let out a quiet whimper, as if he could feel the weight of the tension in the room. The night had stretched long, and exhaustion settled into everyone's bones, but no one dared to sleep. They were waiting, hoping, praying. Minutes felt like hours. The head doctor finally returned, holding the new test results in his hands. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something cautious yet urgent. Ethan stepped forward, barely able to contain his breath. "Well?" he asked, his voice sharp with anticipation. The doctor hesitated, then handed Ethan the results. "You might be onto something," he admitted. "We ran the tests again, and the numbers don't match what we originally thought." Aiden's mother gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. His father exhaled sharply, his whole body tensing. "What does that mean?" he demanded. Ethan's eyes scanned the papers, his mind working at lightning speed. His fingers traced over the numbers, analyzing every detail, connecting the dots. Then suddenly his head snapped up. "This changes everything," he breathed. The doctors exchanged wary glances. "Ethan, we need to be sure before we jump to conclusions," one of them warned. "I am sure," Ethan said firmly. His voice carried a confidence he hadn't felt in years. Aiden was being treated based on a misdiagnosis. His condition is serious, yes, but it's not what they thought it was. He looked at Aiden's parents, his expression intense. "There's a chance we can save him." Aiden's mother let out a strangled sob, tears slipping freely down her face. His father swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he tried to hold himself together. "What do we have to do?" he asked, his voice shaking. Ethan turned to the head doctor. "We need to start treatment immediately. We don't have much time." The doctor frowned. "Ethan, he's weak. A sudden change in medication could be dangerous. If we don't change it, he won't make it through the night," Ethan shot back. He knew he was pushing, but he had never been more certain about anything in his life. "We have to do this." Aiden's mother looked between the doctors, desperation in her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "If there's even a chance." The head doctor let out a deep breath, then gave a short nod. "All right. Let's move fast." Nurses rushed into action, preparing the new treatment under Ethan's careful instructions. Every second counted. Ethan stood by Aiden's bedside, watching over him, his hands clenched into fists. He could see how fragile Aiden was, how his small chest barely rose with each breath. He couldn't afford to be too late. Aiden's eyes fluttered open slightly. "Uncle Ethan," he murmured weakly. Ethan bent down, gripping his hand. "Yeah, buddy." Aiden gave him the faintest smile. "I'm glad you're here." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Me too, kid. Me too." Max let out a soft whimper, nudging his nose against Aiden's arm. Even in his weak state, Aiden managed to lift his fingers just enough to touch Max's fur. "You saved me," he whispered. Max licked his hand gently, his tail wagging just a little. The minutes that followed were a blur of movement. The nurses administered the new treatment while the doctors monitored Aiden closely. His mother never let go of his hand. His father stood stiffly by the window, unable to watch yet unable to look away. Ethan remained at the foot of the bed, his sharp eyes fixed on every flicker of the monitors. And then, something happened. The beeping of the machines, which had been slow and erratic for hours, suddenly changed. It steadied, strengthened. Aiden's breathing, which had been so weak it was barely there, deepened slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The head doctor's eyes widened. "His vitals are stabilizing." Aiden's mother let out a small cry, gripping her husband's arm. His father exhaled sharply, running a shaking hand through his hair. Ethan's heart pounded. It was working, but they weren't out of danger yet. The next few hours would determine everything. If Aiden's body responded to the treatment, there was a chance, just a chance, that they could pull him back from the edge. But if it didn't, Ethan shook the thought from his head. Well, he refused to accept that possibility. He turned to Max, who was still pressed against Aiden's side, refusing to move. "You knew, didn't you?" Ethan murmured. Max looked up at him with those wise, unwavering eyes. The tension in the room remained thick, but for the first time in a long time, there was something else beneath it. Oh, and now all they could do was wait. The hours stretched long and heavy as everyone remained by Aiden's bedside, watching for any sign of improvement. His breathing had steadied, and his heartbeat was stronger than before, but no one dared to celebrate just yet. Every minute felt like a fragile thread, holding on to hope but fearing that it could snap at any moment. Aiden's mother whispered quiet prayers. His father stood stiff as stone, and Ethan never took his eyes off the monitors. Max hadn't moved from Aiden's side. His head rested gently on the boy's arm, his warm breath rising and falling in sync with Aiden's. Even in sleep, the dog remained alert, ears twitching at the slightest movement. He had sensed something before anyone else. Maybe he could sense what was coming next, too. Aiden's fingers twitched. His mother gasped, leaning forward. "Aiden," she whispered, gripping his hand tighter. His eyelids fluttered, his lips parting slightly. Then, after what felt like forever, his eyes opened just enough to see the people around him. A flood of relief washed over the room. His mother covered her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. His father let out a shaky breath. Ethan exhaled, his body finally releasing some of the tension he had been holding. "You're okay," Aiden's mother whispered, smoothing back his hair. Aiden blinked slowly, looking from face to face until his gaze landed on Ethan. "Uncle." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yeah, kiddo. I'm here." For a moment, everything felt lighter. It was working. The treatment was working. Maybe, just maybe, they had pulled him back from the edge in time. But then something changed. The monitors let out a sharp, shrill beep. The numbers on the screen flickered wildly. Aiden's body tensed, his breathing suddenly erratic. His fingers, which had been warm in his mother's grasp just seconds ago, went cold. Panic surged through the room. "No, no, no," Aiden's mother sobbed as doctors and nurses rushed in. Ethan's heart pounded as he scanned the monitors, his mind racing. What had gone wrong? "He's crashing," one of the doctors shouted, already working to stabilize him. "His body's rejecting the treatment." Ethan shook his head, his pulse roaring in his ears. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. "It was working. It was working." Aiden's small body convulsed slightly, his lips turning pale. His mother sobbed harder, clutching onto her husband, who looked completely shattered. Ethan clenched his fists. He had spent years running from medicine, convincing himself he was no longer capable of saving lives. But now, with Aiden slipping through his fingers, he knew he couldn't let fear stop him. He had to do something. The doctors worked frantically, adjusting the medication, checking his vitals. The minutes stretched painfully, each second heavier than the last. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the monitors steadied. Aiden's body went still again, not in the way that signaled the worst, but as if he had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. The tension in the room didn't ease. Aiden was alive, but something wasn't right. Ethan turned to the doctor, his mind still spinning. Why would his body react like that, he asked. It was improving before. The doctor hesitated, flipping through Aiden's chart. Then his expression darkened. "It doesn't make sense unless," he trailed off, his brows furrowing. "Unless what?" Ethan pressed. The doctor inhaled sharply. "Unless something else is happening inside his body that we didn't see before." Aiden's mother gasped. "You mean, another condition?" Ethan felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. "We need to run another test," he said urgently. "Something's been hiding in his system. We missed it before." The doctor nodded quickly, already calling for the necessary tests. Nurses moved swiftly, drawing Aiden's blood, checking his vitals again. Ethan's pulse remained rapid as he tried to push back the creeping dread inside him. Max suddenly stood up, ears pinned back, his body tense. He let out a low, uneasy whimper. Ethan looked at him, his stomach twisting. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't move. He simply stared at Aiden, his body language stiff, alert, as if he could feel something none of them could see. Ethan's jaw clenched. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. If anything, the real fight was just beginning. The air in the hospital room was thick with tension. Aiden lay motionless, his breathing slow but steady, as the doctors worked urgently to determine what had gone wrong. His mother sat beside him, gripping his hand with both of hers, whispering prayers under her breath. His father stood at the foot of the bed, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Ethan stood with the doctors, scanning Aiden's latest test results, his mind racing through every possible explanation. Something had been missed, something crucial, and they were running out of time to find it. Max remained frozen near Aiden's bed, his body tense, his ears pinned back. He let out a low whine, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. He had known something was wrong before anyone else, and now Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Max was sensing something even they hadn't figured out yet. A nurse rushed in with the latest test results, handing them to the lead doctor, who read through them quickly. His expression darkened. "There's something else in his system," he murmured. It's not just the misdiagnosis. There's an unknown infection spreading through his body. Ethan's stomach dropped. An infection. The doctor nodded grimly. It was masked by the initial diagnosis. It's been hiding in plain sight. He glanced up at Ethan. We need to act fast. If it spreads any further. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the weight of those words. Aiden's mother choked back a sob. Please, she whispered. Do whatever it takes. Ethan's mind worked at lightning speed. He had spent years away from medicine, doubting himself, convincing himself he wasn't capable of saving lives anymore. But now none of that mattered. Aiden needed him. He wasn't going to fail him. We need to target the infection directly, Ethan said, turning to the doctors. His immune system is too weak for a standard approach. We need a treatment that works fast, but won't overwhelm his body. The lead doctor nodded, already calling for the necessary medication. Nurses hurried to prepare the new treatment, and within minutes, they had administered it. Now all they could do was wait. The seconds dragged into minutes. The tension in the room was suffocating. Aiden's mother refused to let go of his hand. His father barely moved. Ethan watched the monitors, his heart pounding with every flicker of the numbers. Then, slowly, something changed. The erratic beeping of the machines steadied. Aiden's breathing, which had been shallow and unsteady, grew stronger. The color returned to his pale cheeks. The tension in the room didn't break all at once, but a spark of hope ignited in everyone's eyes. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It's working, he murmured. Aiden's mother let out a sob, her shoulders shaking with relief. His father covered his face with his hands, silently trying to pull himself together. And then, just as Ethan was about to step back, something unexpected happened. Max, who had been silent for the past few minutes, suddenly perked up. His ears twitched, his body relaxed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his tail gave a single slow wag. He let out a soft, contented sigh and rested his head on Aiden's arm, as if he knew, truly knew, that the danger had passed. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Somehow, Max had sensed it before any of them. The bond between Aiden and his dog had been unshakable from the start, but now it was undeniable. A few minutes later, Aiden's eyelids fluttered open. His mother let out a gasp, gripping his hand tighter. "Aiden," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Aiden blinked up at her, confusion flickering in his eyes before they landed on Max. A slow smile formed on his lips. "Max," he whispered, his voice still weak but filled with warmth. Max lifted his head and let out a happy whine, licking Aiden's hand gently. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Aiden was going to be okay. The doctors continued monitoring him, ensuring that the treatment was taking full effect. It would be a long recovery, but the worst was over. As the exhaustion finally settled over everyone, Aiden's mother turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved him," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "No," he said, glancing down at Max, who remained protectively by Aiden's side. "He did." Aiden smiled, his fingers curling weakly into Max's fur. The boy who had only days left to live now had a future. And it was all because of the dog who refused to leave his side. The room felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of fear had finally lifted. Aiden was awake, his eyes still tired but filled with warmth. His mother hadn't stopped holding his hand, her grip firm but gentle, as if she was afraid he might slip away again. His father, usually a man of few words, wiped his eyes discreetly, overwhelmed with quiet relief. Ethan stood near the edge of the bed, watching carefully as the monitors confirmed what they had all been hoping for. Aiden was stable. Max remained by Aiden's side, his head resting near the boy's arm, eyes filled with loyalty and love. He had never left him, not once. Even when things had seemed hopeless, he had stayed, sensing something none of them could understand. Aiden weakly reached out, his fingers brushing against Max's fur, and the dog let out a soft, happy whine, his tail thumping lightly against the bed. Ethan let out a slow breath, his body finally allowing him to relax. For the first time in years, he had stepped back into the role of a doctor, and he had saved a life, Aiden's life. The fear, the doubt, the guilt he had carried for so long seemed to fade, replaced by something else. Purpose. The lead doctor entered the room, his expression lighter than before. We'll keep Aiden under observation for the next few days, but his vitals are looking strong. The infection is under control, and the worst is behind him. Aiden's mother let out a quiet sob of relief, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, though it was unclear whether she was speaking to the doctor, to Ethan, or to Max. Perhaps all of them. Ethan nodded, stepping back slightly to give the family their moment. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Aiden's father looking at him with a rare expression of gratitude. "You didn't have to come back," he said quietly. "But you did. And you saved my boy." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "I think he saved himself," he admitted. "He just needed a little help along the way." Aiden let out a weak chuckle from the bed. "Max saved me," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. "He always does." The next few days passed slowly, but each one brought more signs of recovery. Aiden's strength returned little by little, his laughter becoming more frequent. His parents never left his side, but neither did Max. Nurses would come in and out, making their rounds, but Max remained curled up beside Aiden's bed, his watchful eyes never straying too far. Ethan spent more time in the hospital than he had intended, but he didn't mind. He sat with Aiden, telling him stories and distracting him when the nurses had to check his IVs. He shared quiet moments with Aiden's parents, speaking in soft voices about the days ahead. And he spent long moments simply watching Max, still trying to understand how a dog could sense things that even the best doctors couldn't. One evening, as the sun cast golden light through the hospital window, Aiden turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Are you gonna be a doctor again?" he asked. Ethan hesitated. It was a question he had been asking himself since the moment he had walked into the hospital. He had spent so long running from the past, convincing himself that he wasn't meant for this anymore. But Aiden had reminded him why he had chosen medicine in the first place. It had never been about the pressure or the expectations. It had been about helping people. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done doing that yet. "I think so," Ethan finally admitted. "Yeah." Aiden smiled, satisfied with that answer. The day finally came when Aiden was strong enough to leave the hospital. His parents packed up his things, hugging every nurse and doctor who had helped along the way. Ethan stood with Max near the door, watching as Aiden carefully got into the wheelchair that would take him outside. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Ethan asked. Aiden nodded eagerly. "Yeah. But only if Max comes too." Ethan chuckled. "I think you'd have to fight him if you tried to leave without him." Aiden grinned, and Max wagged his tail, as if understanding every word. As they stepped out of the hospital, the fresh air felt different, crisper, clearer. It was the beginning of something new. Aiden was going home, stronger than before. His family had been given a second chance. And Ethan? Well, he wasn't running anymore. As they walked toward the car, Aiden looked down at Max, his voice soft but certain. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered. "You knew I was gonna be okay." Max let out a gentle bark, nudging Aiden's hand with his nose. And somehow, in that simple gesture, Aiden knew the answer.